A very warm welcome to Parliamentary Pondering, and I have with me a very, very old childhood friend who's a very acclaimed international author, Bina Shah, a Pakistani author, acclaimed for her 8 books, incredible books, which some of you might have read, definitely would have read. And she writes on women's rights and feminism, and she says some things which a lot of people don't have the guts to say. So I'm very proud to have her here. She works on women's issues in Pakistan as well as the Muslim world, as well as internationally. She's currently also teaching at the Al Khan Faculty of Arts. We're very lucky to have her. Thank you for being on Parliamentary Pondering.
Thank you for having me, Marvi. What a pleasure.
Thank you. I think what I'd like to start off with, Bina, is the fact that we have currently seen a tremendous pushback on all that has been achieved on women's rights by our great, well, I wouldn't say great grandmothers, but yes, perhaps great grandmothers, yes, what they have achieved, what we personally have achieved. And we are in the midst of a pushback. And for me, what is important is that I personally was part of a National Assembly of Pakistan, which legislated on some incredible legislation. My own legislation on acid crime on women, saving them in 2010, the harassment of women at workforce, 2010, the anti-women forced marriages, 2011, criminal law, which went into the details of the rape, etc., in 2016, domestic violence, etc. So whilst we in Pakistan were part of some incredible legislation, we have seen an international pushback. And I want to talk about the Roe versus Wade 2022. Completely unacceptable. And thank God Europe did not follow suit in the same way. But on the LGBTQ agenda, Russia 2022, the Act, Hungary, the Act in Uganda, the constitutional amendments there, the Parental Rights and Education in Florida, Act of 2022. And generally, I would consider it, if I was to put the pushback, I would say 3 things major: abortion, LGBTQ, education, like the Taliban's, and actually 4th thing, DEI, a huge pushback. We're now going to take this and we're going to push back the pushback. Over to you.
Well, Marvi, that's a lot to digest. So let's try to unpack it locally first, and then we'll move on to the international issues. So you're perfectly correct in saying that we in Pakistan, the women's rights movement, the feminists, the legislators, progressive forces have managed to achieve a lot of pro-women legislation. You've rightly named the anti-acid attack law. There's always been a push for the domestic violence law, which is now, I believe, it's on the books. Child marriage law is promulgated only in Sindh, but not in the rest of the country. So what we're seeing is that we make progress. What looks like pushback is, I would actually say it's a little deceptive in that way. I would say that along with the progress has always come a very steady resistance to these changes. And where we stumble is in the legislation's implementation. So we get the laws on the books, but as far as making sure that the laws are followed, that there are consequences, that there are legal penalties and, jailing and fining and the whole rest of it, that is where we have always fallen short and continue to fall short. So as the Sindh High Court, very accomplished lawyer Sara Malkani has just published a book on this called Progressive Laws in Patriarchal Societies, Lessons from Pakistan.
Superb.
Yeah.
You should all read it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was just launched earlier this month. And it's a very important book because it dissects exactly why and how the legal mechanisms are failing, even though the laws are in place, but the mechanisms to make them work, to implement them, accountability, consequences, these continue to have loopholes that people manage to push through.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, and it's good that such detailed research work has been published in Pakistan. I mean, I'd like to mention Model Legislation, my 5th book, which talks about women empowerment issues, unfinished business, finishing unfinished business. My larger question really is, of course, there is an issue of implementation. But what I'm saying is we are now seeing anti-women a kind of pushback on the legislation. For example, Roe versus Wade. I mean, that is a legislative pushback. So whilst, yes, implementation remains to be a major issue, they're now having the guts to push back on legislation. But I want to take it now. We've talked a lot about legislation. I want to spend a few minutes talking about how women issues in terms of diversity, this whole DEI agenda has been pushed back in certain areas of the world, thank God, not in all. But when there's a pushback in one of the major countries of the world, of course, it has a ripple effect on the others as well. So yes, you cannot have people saying that it's okay, thank God, there was too much, we couldn't deal with it. So yes, you're right. I mean, it was always there. The resistance was there, but the resistance is now getting a bit more power because it's getting power from the country that from the US, and this is having an impact everywhere.
Well, you're absolutely right in the sense that the decision in the United States to reverse Roe versus Wade, which is the landmark legislation that made abortion legal across the country. And now what's happened is that states are being allowed to decide for themselves, and the states themselves are going back and disallowing abortion state by state. So it's a little bit. Now, a lot of those decisions, for example, what this does is it affects Pakistan in this way, that when the United States decides that they're not going to fund programs that help women in developing nations such as ours have access to abortion care, contraceptive care, family planning programs get affected. There's no money to educate people on how to space their families, how to take care of themselves with their reproductive health. So it's not necessarily that it's affecting abortion directly, but affects the programs that include abortion care. And the argument is made that abortion care, reproductive health care, it's part of women's health.
Yes.
The other side is that, well, no, there's the pro-life argument, and we really don't want to murder children.
I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that because the development dollars have been cut. Other than the US aid, which of course is a great impact on the development scene, the fact that all those family planning tools that were there had been bought, kept, stored, but could not be shipped off to the right places. And the fact that people will be suffering as a result, that is anti-humanity, I feel. So yes, we have certain views, Bina, you and I think we share quite a few views on the gender agenda. Others might not. I respect that. I respect difference of opinion, but I will also fight for what I believe in. And that is the entire, but I will fight respectfully. The respectful fight must go on. What I am against, and we've been talking about this in Parliamentary Pondering a little bit, is the tone of the pushbacks. It needs to be civil. We need to have a civil discourse. There is a right to everyone's opinion. You have a right to disagree with me.
Yes.
But I don't have a right to disagree with you disagreeably or in a fashion which then reduces your rights.
Well, so what you're talking about is the difference between reform and radicalism. And radicalism is the more vocal, the more voluble, the more militant movement. But I think that in a country like Pakistan, it's a reformist movement that will help. And we have a beautiful example of that in last month's Supreme Court judgment, where Justice Aisha Malik allowed a woman to seek khula and give khula through the court without her husband's permission, which was never an Islamic requirement in the first place. She also ruled that psychological abuse is as much a reason to grant a khula as physical abuse. And the pushback comes in forms of like, well, my wife is disobedient and therefore I'm disciplining her and therefore she shouldn't be allowed a kula. And the third part of the ruling was that disobedience cannot be claimed unless there is evidence. So this is an example of dignified response, dignified reform, and reform with the stamp of government approval, legislative approval.
And judicial backing.
And when this came in the newspapers, that it's front page on every newspaper that Justice Aisha Malik has ruled that a woman doesn't need a man's permission, her husband's permission to seek kula, which is Islamic divorce for women. As you know, the men can declare talaq, but the women have to go through a court process. It really broke through a huge impediment that Pakistani women have been facing for decades. But it was done in such a elegant way that nobody could really argue against.
No, I like the example that you have shared. I want to now touch upon how women are viewed internationally. I mean, when I speak at conferences globally and when you speak at conferences globally, there's always a common denominator, especially with women parliamentarians or women politicians. I want to understand if you have the same common denominator in the author world, in the literary world with women. How are women projected, women authors or women politicians projected on media, and especially social media, the kind of backlash that happens when anyone tries to say anything respectfully, the kind of disrespect that one receives, or the kind of if for example, I used to find this kind of not acceptable that the headlines used to be, and the photographs of women walking into the National Assembly used to be on the kind of sunglasses or bags that they were carrying. And versus all the legislation that we were doing. We were the ones doing the legislation inside, and that didn't make headlines. What made headlines was what we were wearing. So the whole aspect of how a woman looks, wears, talks is under scrutiny.
Absolutely.
What a man, politician, wears, looks, talks, does is not under scrutiny. I want to shift gear and ask you the same question from a literary point of view. What are the issues that you are facing in the literary world as far as women, projection of women in media?
Well, we have a very interesting debate about how they design book covers that are written by books that are written by women that might appeal more to women. And the book cover is always something of, it's an image of a woman, but her face is turned away, so you can't see her face. You'll just see the back of her head like this, or you'll just see maybe a foot or a hand. And we're talking about, again, how women are seen as objectified.
Objectified is the right word,
objectified, and also just sort of like only partially there. Like, we're never thought of as full human beings, full adults. It's always got to be some kind of pose or some kind of play that's going on. As far as the criticism of women in politics, yes, the reason is it's easy. It's always been easy to attack women for how they look, how they're dressed, this is, because women have throughout the ages mostly been valued for their beauty, for their fertility. So this is the only thing that people seem to fixate on. It also allows you to be distracted from what the issues at hand are.
Absolutely. It's an easy distraction.
It's a gender trick, and it's a very insidious one.
And last but not the least, this whole DEI conversation in the West, how do you feel about that?
I haven't really followed it as much just because I'm more concerned with what happens in this part of the world. And I'm happy to say that although, yes, the United States has turned away from DEI and really worked very hard to unimplement what they had implemented, in Pakistan, DEI is still an important thing, especially when we look at the corporate sector. And when we look at the inclusion of women in job opportunities, in professional environments, in educational opportunities, because for us, it's still an issue. In America, there's the feeling that, well, we've already achieved women's equality, so why are we taking so many extreme extra steps? We know very well in Pakistan that we haven't got close to what it needs to be. So companies, corporate sector, educational institutes are still very focused on the inclusion of women, the diversity of people in the workplace, and to have yeah, to basically make sure that everybody gets equal opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get into the debate of the women's reserve seat because that'll be a very long debate. But that got us all in, and we had a voice through it. But we also, I mean, I remember BISP, the Benazir Income Support Program, was the first to launch to give opportunities to transgenders.
Yes.
That was as per the law. We were just implementing the
Yeah.
law. So, I mean, we will not accept a DEI pushback for the reasons. And I want to be clear on this because it comes from our core. And my core is Bhitai, and I do want to mention him, and so must be you be fond of Bhitai. Alam Sabha baat kare, right? So for me, the inclusivity angle is super important. I will talk about the fact that the inclusivity is being decreased by a kind of bullying effect. And there is wealth and diversity. I say that in most of the parliamentary pondering that I've done because it's an important one. Whatever we're talking about, if we cannot accept the diversity element, we're not going to be progressing.
Well, you mentioned Bhitai, who is very close to any Sindhi's heart, and really any Pakistani's heart. Bhitai was a symbol of tolerance, tolerance and compassion for fellow human beings. And I think that the basis of human rights and the tolerance for other people comes down to when you understand that I may have a way of life, you have a different belief system, different way of life, but that does not harm me. Your way of life and your beliefs and your living doesn't directly harm me. And I think that that's sort of what we need to keep in mind when we're looking at DEI or any sort of inclusivity, empowerment, women's seats in parliament, anything having to do with that. We really need to think about it as an issue of not only being tolerant towards one another, but having a self-confidence that, hey, what you believe in isn't going to change my belief. It's not going to harm me.
And last but not the least, I know you are very humble about your own achievements. In terms of your books that you've written, the 8 big books that we all are super proud of, what are the women empowerment issues that you have tackled through them?
Particularly in my last 2 novels. So we're talking about Before She Sleeps, which was published in 2018, and its sequel, The Monsoon War, which came out in 2023. These are my, what I would call feminist dystopias. Now, this is an offshoot of science fiction, what Margaret Atwood would call speculative fiction. What could happen in the future? Not in terms of, aliens and spaceships, but what are we going to see in society? And I was very taken with the understanding that in the future, women's survival as a species may not be guaranteed. There may be forces that actually force us to confront a world that has fewer women. I'm thinking about things like selective sex abortion, for example, which has caused millions of girls to be missing in India. There's like several million, I think. I don't know the numbers now, but it was quite high at the time that I wrote the book. And so I thought, well, what would a society look like with fewer women? And what would be the repercussions on society? And I was also looking at technology and how technology can be used in an authoritarian way to control, to surveil. So I had all of these ideas in mind and themes in mind when I wrote those 2 books. And the sequel is the first book is very much about the repression and the sort of underground resistance to patriarchy. The sequel is very much about an overt resistance to patriarchy in the form of militancy. So I have a women's army that takes up arms and actually fights on the battleground against misogynist patriarchal forces. So I've tried to look at this from 2 different angles, and I had a lot of fun and I learned a lot while I was writing and researching these books.
Tremendous contribution. Bina, thank you so much for being on Parliamentary Pondering.